Hi there, this is an expedited version of the lecture Design Principles Part 1, where we're talking about figure ground, unity and variety, and balance. Um, First things first, we discussed composition, which is the arrangement of visual elements in a piece of art. So basically anything that contributes to composition will change the way that we view it. And I like this quote. It says, "The four sides of the paper are the first lines of the composition," because assuming we are working on a surface with four edges, which is not always the case, but if we are, those edges also contribute to the composition. When we're looking at something that is sort of enclosed like this within four edges, we call that the picture plane. And this is a sort of silly view of that, just to illustrate the fact that we're basically cropping something when we put it onto a picture plane, whether that's representational like this house or an abstract composition that would potentially go off the edges and give the illusion that there's more beyond that frame. When we talk about figure and ground, we're talking about positive and negative space. They're kind of interchangeable. The figure is sort of the object and the ground is the background. It's easy to understand if you're thinking about a portrait, because the figure is the person and the ground is what's behind it. However, sometimes it's not always as easy to decipher the two, which I'll get into in just a second. Here are three examples of using positive and negative space in different ways. So depending on how this image is cropped, we can see a balance of positive and negative space, with the tree and all the black being the positive space and the white being the negative space. Now, this is what's kind of confusing, because the white is the ground, even though the black is technically the ground of the, earth. So that's why you'll often notice me using positive and negative space instead of figure ground relationships. This is an example of a lot more negative space, and that gives a sense of expansiveness. It can also give a sense of loneliness or solitude. It tends to be, sort of calming. And then more positive space is zoomed in. And we can see this tree going off the edges of the picture plane. Now, there's benefits to different types of framing formats, but in general, I would say that this one with more positive space going off the edges is generally pretty interesting, because number one, we don't know if there's more trees right next to this one. Here we do, and that's what is accomplished with all this negative space. It looks like it's alone in this area. Here we don't know, so it creates a little bit of a sense of mystery. Also, by breaking up the negative space into multiple sections as opposed to sort of one large section that goes around the tree, that creates variety, which I'll explain later is generally appealing in a design. So taking shapes off the edges of your picture plane can be really effective. However, it does give a zoomed in view, and it takes up a lot of that negative space. The relationship between figure and ground can be three different types of relationships. Stable is basically like the tree. We know what the figure is and we know what the ground is. And generally speaking, when we have a large area of a background and a smaller object that sits on top of it, it tells us that the larger area is the ground or the negative space. And we usually associate the larger quantity of space being the negative space, depending on what we're looking at, of course, but especially in an abstract composition like this. The dot appears to be the figure or the positive space. The white appears to be the ground. The ground is dominating the composition, and this pops out. It's sitting on top. Reversible means that it can kind of go back and forth depending on the way that you're looking at the design. We don't know if this is black stripes on white background or white stripes on a black background, and that has to do with the fact that they're equal quantities and they're all going off the edges, so we don't know, and our eye will switch between the two. Ambiguous is similar as reversible. We don't really know. They can appear to be both figure and ground at the same time, and it's defined as, equally interesting shapes. So we're not really necessarily wondering necessarily. It's just a matter of interpretation, and your eye is sort of following whatever the composition is. So I would say reversible, and ambiguous share plenty of similarities. Stable is kind of off on its own. The biggest difference between these two is sort of that reversible is kind of playing with your eye, and ambiguous, you might not really care as much what the figure is and what the ground is, and I'll show you some optical illusions here. So these are examples of how things might toy with us. Generally looking at this poster here, we would say that C3PO is the figure and this creamy background is the ground, but then as we look closer, we notice that the figure is also the ground for another scene on top of it. So we can see a relationship that shifts depending on what you're looking at, and also how far away you are from the object. If you're standing up close, you might notice this scene first, and then notice that it's part of a larger figure. And then if you walked up to this poster from really far away, you'd probably notice C3PO as the figure, and then you would notice this detail within it. Over here, Escher, who was really famous for doing optical illusions in artwork, we can see that at the top of the composition, the white is the ground, the black is the figure, and then it gets ambiguous and reversible in the middle and starts playing with our eyes, and then it reverses where the black is the ground and the white is the figure. And we can see that movement between the fish and the birds, and it creates an optical illusion. So you don't have to necessarily define one or the other. You don't have to assign things to one or the other, and these relationships can be used to create optical illusions. Unity and variety is pretty self-explanatory. Unity is things that share similarities, and that can be color, it can be shape, it can be size, it can be other different qualities, texture, pattern. So this example shows that unity is created not only in the fact that there's a bunch of yellow and it's sitting on blue, so it's kind of a limited palette which creates unity, but we also see these shapes creating unity. We have the hats making smaller triangles, the shapes of the people making larger triangles. We have larger circles here. We have smaller kind of circular shapes that go into the tree shapes and then into the sort of pom-poms on their clothing. And that basically unifies everything all together. So there's a lot of unity in this composition. Variety, pretty self-explanatory. That's the opposite. Variety is just different things, and it's a way to increase visual interest. That could be, once again, color, texture, shape, all different things, size. We can see here there's plenty of unity. We see these blue kind of droplet shapes repeated. We see this sort of shape repeated, but there's also a lot of variety. And generally speaking, when we're working on a piece of art, we're balancing unity and variety together. You usually want some unity and some variety, and then you tweak the amount of unity and variety depending on your goals. If you want your composition to be maybe more active and dynamic, you might crank up the variety. And if you want the composition to be more calming and sort of predictable, then you would select unity and add more unity. But there's still variety in here because this isn't all yellow, and there's certainly different types of shapes. They're not all circles, there's triangles. So you can see that there's unity, variety in both of these pieces, but this has more variety and the other one has more unity. Here we can see examples of unity and variety. Okay, so unity equals same color and same shape. Variety is different sizes. Here we see unity is same shape and same size, and variety is different colors. And then over here we have different colors, different sizes, but they're all the same shape. So that's still unifying the composition. And Kandinsky here was able to get away with using a bunch of different colors and sizes because the fact that they're all circles really brings everything together, and that unifies this composition in our eyes as the viewer. There are several different types of balance, but we're focusing on symmetry versus asymmetry, with symmetry being balanced, predictable, stable, and calming usually, and asymmetry has some imbalance. Usually it's visually balanced, but not perfectly balanced like symmetry. It's unpredictable, it's less stable, and it's more active and dynamic. So we can tell between these two images that this one is looking much more active, and this one feels a bit more calming. Bilateral symmetry or formal symmetry is when we see things split down the middle vertically. You know, some will say that split horizontally top to bottom also creates symmetry. It is technically a form of symmetry, but generally it's not used as widely as bilateral left to right. And it's a mirror image. So basically it just means that if you folded it in half, it would be the same on either side. Radial symmetry means that the symmetry comes out from a center point. The easiest way to think about radial symmetry is that they're slices of pie, and those slices of pie, whether you have to define where they are, but those slices of pie are going to be the same, repeated around in a circle. And I like this example because it shows us how we can pick these sort of crazy psychedelic colors and the image still looks relatively calming. Radial symmetry is used in mandalas. You see it a lot in sort of religious imagery, rose windows. Various cultures use radial symmetry in some sort of kind of spiritual sense. We also see it in nature, which I'll show you in a second, but radial symmetry goes around from a center point. Crystallographic symmetry, basically, the easiest way to say is a pattern. It's something that's repeated. Sometimes you're going to find that it's easier to discover where the separation is and how it's repeating. Others, you kind of have to figure out where that repetition is happening, where the boundaries are. But generally speaking, any sort of wrapping paper or fabric, would be crystallographic symmetry because there is a repetition happening. One thing will kind of come up again, and you can imagine that it could go on forever. There's no real boundaries to crystallographic symmetry. Asymmetry basically is none of those things. Asymmetry means that we don't have repeated objects. We don't have a pattern or a predictable mirror image. So this is a famous example where we can see obviously the wave is much heavier on this side and it creates a lot of movement. Asymmetry is much more dynamic in nature. Here we can see some symmetry and asymmetry in nature. A lot of things in nature are sort of designed with bilateral symmetry. Most animals have some sort of bilateral symmetry, as we can see with the zebra, person, and a beetle. Coral polyp and a starfish and snowflake all have some form of radial symmetry. And then we can see a sponge and a tree here with asymmetry. And then, of course, a honeycomb, which would be crystallographic symmetry. So we can see that there is plenty of symmetry and asymmetry examples in nature. For the rest of the lecture, we went through several different images and talked about them as a class and analyzed them in these terms. So I will make sure that you have access to a PDF of these images in the slideshow, and I would like for you to email me and analyze at least 2 of these pieces and talk about what you see. Just describe it in terms of what we discussed. So that would be unity and variety, positive and negative space, and symmetry and asymmetry. You're probably going to see several things, in each piece. You're going to see several examples of unity and several examples of variety. Describe if the image is symmetrical or asymmetrical, or if there's qualities of asymmetry or symmetry together in the same piece, which is possible as well. and also talk about what qualifies as the positive space and what qualifies as the negative space. And by analyzing those two works, you will make up some of your participation that you missed in class. I hope you find this lecture helpful, and let me know if you have any questions.